when we look at Marion the leader, we can go back and we can look at several different things. The first thing that pops to mind for me are the big five personality factors. The big five factors are neuroticism, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. And you want more or less in the specific areas. When we look at neuroticism, it's a tendency to be depressed, anxious, insecure, vulnerable, and hostile. This was not Francis Marion. Francis Marion was a very cool, calm, collected individual. He portrayed himself in a very strong manner, despite his physical deficiencies, despite his very small stature and that hooked nose and those knocked knees. This is a man who held himself strong and proud, and his soldiers recognized it. Both the paid Continental soldiers recognized it, the volunteer militiamen recognized it, and the enemy sure recognized it as well. So we're looking at a man here that has come in and, despite his traits, he has stood strong. He makes wise decisions. He is not hostile. In fact, when we start talking about the virtues of Marion coming up, he is a man that is not hostile, begs for reconciliation between neighbors despite where they fought in the war. He was a very, very strong individual. He was extroverted in the sense that he had positive energy. Francis Marion was not an excitable individual, as noted through the documentation that portrays an accurate description of Francis Marion. However, he did have a positive energy. His band of men were very akin to that. I believe I said it earlier, but much like Robin Hood and his band of men, they were a family. They were a very tight-knit group, and they had to work under some of the most austere conditions in order to effect the change that was required to establish our great nation. And these guys are doing it at the end of the war, when everybody's tired, worn out, and food is short, and war is plentiful, and the enemy is plentiful, and Marion takes his men and motivates them, rallies them in order to engage this enemy, and uses his energy and their energy to bring us the United States of America. He was an open individual. He was informed. He was creative. He was insightful. When we look at it, this is a man that defied, as I mentioned earlier, conventional military methodology of warfare. He did asymmetrical or guerrilla warfare tactics, as mentioned that he learned in the French and Indian War. So he was able to say, hey, I have limited resources. My people are not regular army type. They are not professionally trained to what was the military standard of that day. But what they did know, and he knew, was they knew the woods, they knew how to ambush, they knew the terrain and the terrain features, could move across them very easily and very well because it's where they grew up hunting and fishing. And these backwood boys knew what they were going into, where their British enemy did not. So he, again, like I noted, he defied that conventional wisdom. He chose the guerrilla tactics. He was creative. He was insightful. And because of this, he changed the outcome of the American Revolution. And not only that, he changed the way we look at war fighting today. When we start looking at tactics utilized by the Special Forces and the Rangers and different special operations groups all across the world, we can take back and look at what Francis Marion did in the swamps of South Carolina, and that is why he is hailed as the father of guerrilla warfare tactics and the implementation thereof. Next thing we look at in the Big Five, we're moving on to number 4 now. This is his agreeableness, and that is the tendency to be accepting, comforting, trusting, and nurturing. Now, this is a pretty stoic individual, so he's not going around holding hands and, passing out warm, fuzzy feelings to everybody. But what he is doing is he is taking care of his people. He is humane. He is noted by his friend Peter Ory that of all the men that ever drew the sword, Marion was the most humane. He was more humane to his enemy. He was also more humane to his soldiers in rallying them. Specifically at that time, there were lashings. There was corporal punishment that was found within the ranks because that is the way of the day. But you can look at his numbers and you can look at what was the way he took on his subordinates, and he took very good care of them. He ensured that his soldiers were well groomed and shaved. He even had a barber in camp. He maintained haircut standards for his soldiers in the field. They had to have it cut right, or they had to have it braided. So we're looking at a guy that, really did care about his people and took the best care of them with what little he had, and demanded, his expectation was that of success. And he built the trust within his people to move forward within the fight despite the lack of everything they had. Finally, when we look at Francis Marion in the Big Five traits, this brings us to number 5, which is conscientiousness. And this is described as being thorough, organized, controlled, dependable, decisive, and all of those things were Francis Marion. His nature helped him build the respect of his men. He did more doing than talking. He was dependable in his word and what needed to be done. You could find him as being a very controlled man that didn't let his emotions overcome him. And with his, and we'll point out in a second, but his virtuous nature, he did what was right. So he made decisive action both in warfare and both following the war when enemies were captured, etc. He was very thorough. He was a detailed planner. He did well by his men there. So that's looking at the top 5 personality traits and how they applied to Francis Marion.